Stephen Weiner is director of the Maynard Public Library in Maynard, Massachusetts. He is also the author of Faster Than a Speeding Bullet, The Rise of the Graphic Novel. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you.
You have just presented a paper on the graphic novel as it pertains to the library. Two-pronged question here. You see the graphic novel as a way of attracting an audience that wouldn't perhaps normally go into the library. But how many of these graphic novels, and before we start that, could you give us a definition of a graphic novel?
Sure. The definition is still in flux. The term was popularized in 1978 by Will Eisner, who wrote and illustrated a book called The Contract with God and Other Stories of Tenement Life. And he'd been a successful cartoonist, and he was trying to do a mature story, and so he wanted to sell it to some mainstream publishers. He knew people at BAnQ Publishing, and he said to the editor there, he said, "I've got something to show you." He couldn't call it a comic book, so he said, "It's a graphic novel." And the term has become the popular term. But the definition is in flux, but what it means is really a long comic book that has two covers on it and has a beginning, middle, and end. So it can apply to a single story, such as Jimmy Corrigan, the smartest boy on earth, or it can apply to a complete story within an ongoing character, say Spider-Man, A Bad Day at the Zoo. There's still more Spider-Man stories, but that one is a graphic novel. It can also apply to nonfiction works. They're also called graphic novels. Miles, which is the story of Art Spiegelman trying to resolve his issues with his father, who hasn't resolved his issues with being a concentration camp survivor, it's called a graphic novel. In fact, it's the most famous graphic novel. But it's not fiction. It's not a novel. It's nonfiction.
So is there more text in a graphic novel than there might be in a traditional comic book?
No.
It's a comic book, basically, that someone's called a graphic novel. Because
exactly.
Why'd they call it a graphic novel if it's just a comic book?
As I said during my presentation, the comic book industry had been so maligned, it was a way to try to give it some respectability.
Simply by changing the name.
Yeah, and they're still trying. I mean, it's still an issue.
Yeah, and a lot of bibliophiles will look down their nose at comic books. They still do. It's interesting, though. There's nothing new about this, because I know when I was a kid, we used to read Rupert the Bear books in England, and that was actually published, as I recall, by one of the newspapers. Could have been the Telegraph. And their thinking was, I think, similar to what you're discussing, and that is, let's get these young kids reading anything, reading something that they're interested in and that's fun, so that that's used as a stepping stone to getting into the traditional novel. Seems to me that that's the essence of what you're doing here, in terms of the libraries. That's
one of the uses. You can talk to lots of public librarians, and they'll talk about how successful, how popular the Tintin books are, and then people grow out of them and start reading quote-unquote real books. And that's certainly one of the aims. That was my initial aim. But, since then I've learned that there's a very significant adult readership, and these people just like the format.
They stuck with it. They prefer that format to the...
Well, they don't necessarily prefer it, but they don't want to give it up either. They may read novels. They may read them interchangeably, but they're not going to give these up. That's really what has caused the whole change. It's that these people they still want it. They want a story about Batman for them at 35, not for them at 12. And that's why you have these mature storylines.
It's fascinating because, again, I just don't associate comic books with adults, and I don't imagine most people do.
Right.
But you've obviously uncovered. How did you get a hold of these statistics? How did you come by this knowledge?
The really interesting thing in the United States is that in the 1970s, this retail anomaly developed called the comic book specialty shop. And at one point, there were about 9,000 in the United States. And these grew out of the convention. They used to have comic book conventions where people would sell old comics at high prices. They realized that if they sold new materials as well, they could bring in people who weren't collectors. And they developed a whole format from the comic book industry, from the publishers, to deal with these comic book stores. these things were bought on a non-returnable basis, which means that the retailer had to know how many he was going to sell. As a result, the people got to know their clientele very well because they couldn't return the materials like you could on a newsstand. And a couple of big vendors, kind of people in the middle, grew, and the biggest one is Diamond, which is at this point the only one. There was another one called Capital, another one called Cold Cut in the 80s, but they went out of business. And so Diamond's they're the only people left that take the books from the publisher and resell them to the comic book store expressly. Other people do it, but they also do it to libraries. But so they've collected all this data, and it's their data.
You tell a lovely story then of the fact that the libraries in the United States are cottoning on to this, and that as a librarian you were one of the first to tap into this information, this knowledge. Perhaps you could talk about when you went to the comic book store and you saw all these young boys.
Oh, sure. Well, as I said, I'd been a teacher before I became a librarian, and I'd used comics as a way to motivate students because I was a special education teacher, so a lot of times I was working with people whose reading skills weren't what they could be. And then when I became a librarian, I still had some interest in comics. It wasn't a great interest. I just went over probably to see what was interesting in the store, and I saw that there were all these teenage boys just hanging around in the store. And I thought, if we could, one of my goals was to get these teenage boys to come to the library. So I said, if this is what's going to entice them, then I'll work on getting this in there.
There's a bit of a question of whether a library should reflect the demand out there or serve as some sort of an arbitrator of taste, or an institution that houses the best that has been written and produced. It seems to me there's a bit of tension there. Do you see any inherent value in the stories that these... it seems to me that most of them are like sort of mediocre television that's printed. Intrinsic artistic value in these, do you think?
I think in some of them there are. I think that...
Which ones would those be?
Well, the short list would be, in terms of books that would attract readers who generally don't enjoy comic books, would be Maus, would be one. The most famous, M-A-U-S, Maus.
Like plural of Chairman Mao.
Correct. Cleverness is the main character is a mouse. So, and that, if you're not familiar with that, that's a story about the cartoonist father and mother surviving the concentration camps in World War II, and there, in it, the Jews are mice and the Nazis are cats. And it's a very, very powerful story. It's now actually required reading in the United States in 9th grade. It's entered the curriculum, which I don't think the cartoonist is very happy about, but anyway, it has.
Why isn't he happy about it?
He thinks they're too young for that book. It's too brutal. And he tried to soften it by making the characters into animals, but it's a very brutal story because it's about people that never recovered. Even though they physically survived, they never recovered. And he himself is a victim of it because of growing up with his parents.
Animal Farm.
Yeah, but
with pictures. Animal Farm with pictures.
Right. You could say that.
And you think it's in the same league as Animal Farm?
I think it's much better than Animal Farm. I'll go to the mat with anybody over 10 or 12 of these. Some of them are just really brilliant pieces of work. I would agree with you that most of them are mediocre. Some of them are very well delivered genre pieces. The most famous one is Sandman by Neil Gaiman. And
is he British?
Yes.
Yeah, he's getting some ink.
Oh yeah, he actually became so big that he exploded out of the comic book industry, and now he writes novels and he writes films, and he's a big guy. But his origins were in the graphic novel. Right. The Sandman story is a really fascinating story. He created a group of gods that are older than any of the mythologies. And the main character is the Sandman, who's the Lord of Dreams. And he has siblings who the goddess of death and the god of destruction, etc. But what he did so successfully is because they're older than gods, he was able to work all of history into his narrative. So people like William Shakespeare and Marco Polo, they're characters. In his view, the Midsummer's Night Dream was only written to entertain the Sandman. And it's a great story. It won the World Fantasy Award in 1991, actually. but he was able to incorporate so much more because of the timelessness of his characters, and he was clever enough to figure that out.
But the Sandman, I mean, it's like a comic book, except
Correct.
It seems to me that to have a storyline, it's probably got a bit more text than the normal comic book.
Well, it depends. You're working. How do I say this? There are really two kinds of ways to create a comic book or a graphic novel. And one is you have a writer who comes up with a story and then writes the dialogue and writes the captions and tells the illustrator what to do. And the other one is the person who does both, who draws and writes, the cartoonist. And they, generally speaking, if that happens, there's fewer words because they're letting the pictures tell the story. They're generally writers first. I'm sorry, they're generally artists first.
Artists first. So a bit like William Blake, then, going back a few hundred years.
Yeah. But when you have a writer and an artist working together, there really has to be a real synergy. Otherwise, the two different facets of the book end up competing with each other. But in his case, because he was such a good writer, understood the visual aspects so well, it always worked out. In fact, he did what the best comic book writers do, which is after they know who they're going to be working with, they study the artist and they say, this person does this kind of city scene really well, so I'm going to write it so he can draw this or she can draw this. And they play to the artist's strengths, the same way that if a movie director, for example, may say, okay, I'm going to make a movie with Jack Nicholson. Well, this is the kind of thing that he does well.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I automatically thought of a screenwriter. Mm-hmm. Picturing the scene as opposed to simply working from their imagination entirely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm talking with Stephen Weiner, director of the Maynard Public Library in Maynard, Massachusetts. He is the author of a book called Faster Than a Speeding Bullet, The Rise of the Graphic Novel. You talk about the outlaw status of comics. Mm-hmm. You talk about the fact that it's has magnetic qualities, because you're a librarian. The fact that they pretty well promote themselves just in and of way that they look. These could be used by not only libraries but by bookstores, mm-hmm. by anyone that wants to attract an audience of readers that may not just automatically come to mind.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. And most major bookstores in the United States have graphic novel collections now, mm-hmm. and some of the independent ones do as well.
And again, the fact that adults make up the largest percentage of the readers of this particular kind of book. You also talk about the fact that this genre is growing very, very quickly, second only to young adult Harry Potter type knockoffs.
Right. Yeah, at this point, most publishing houses in the United States are expanding two divisions. One, their young adult division with books they're hoping to attract the Harry Potter readers with, and a graphic novel division.
And again, I suppose we think of librarians as being rather, let's say, elitist, but certainly if someone would frown on this kind of book, anyone would. It would be a librarian.
I think you're pretty much right on that. And it's still the minority, and it's still a battle for libraries, but I think that's changing. And it's changing because as the younger people became librarians, and they just didn't want to give this up. And so they're promoting it in part because of self-interest.
You talked about Mouse. Can you give our listeners your top 10 all-time greatest graphic novels in terms of the best that you think have ever been written?
Okay. We'll start with Mouse, which I think is the greatest graphic novel ever produced.
Now, how much would one of those babies cost, the first printing of that?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I mean, that was published by... Interesting about that is that was published by in his own magazine called Raw that he did in the United States.
R-A-W?
Correct. And he did that when it was a way to promote underground cartoonists, and he was one of them.
Like Crumb, was he?
Yeah, I think he knows Crumb, but Crumb wasn't involved with that. A lot of the people that are popular now, people like Charles Burns, who did Black Hole, that's how they started 20 years ago or so.
How did they start?
They started in Raw magazine with him.
Okay, so he's a bit of an icon
over
and above the mere fact that he's the artist and writer.
Oh yeah, and he was a prominent cartoonist before Miles. He was big enough so that he had a book of his published by a major publisher called Breakdown that was a collection of strips. It's going to be republished next year, I believe. It's been out of print for a lot of years. But I think Miles is the #1 book. I think if you want to do serious fiction books, then Jimmy Corrigan, The Smartest Boy on Earth, is probably #2. That's the story of a young man who is trying to come to terms with the fact that he has discovered he has a family in midlife, that he's found his father and his sister. But the really fascinating thing about it is that because the cartoonist is so skilled, through the illustrations and through the narrative itself, you experience what the character is experiencing. So he's not really telling a story, you're living the story. That may be the most technically advanced book, period, in my opinion. Then you have a really important book is this book I mentioned called Understanding Comics, which was the first attempt to give both people in the comic book industry, cartoonists, and people outside just a point of entry. Because McCloud, the cartoonist, felt that there was a whole potential for comics that was untapped. And that's because cartoonists themselves didn't see what the potential really was. So that's why he did that book. But it became a big hit with mainstream readers. It's a very, very big hit. He's gone on to become a college lecturer, So then we've got 3. Then I think that you really can't ignore a book like Bone. I think Bone's the best. Bone is the story of these 3 cousins. They're from this place called Boneville. They're kind of Donald Ducky characters. One's just there for a gag, and one is a very scheming and greedy person. The other one is a good-hearted person. They get run out of town, and they actually go to a part of the world that they're just totally lost, and they become involved in a battle kind of an Armageddon in a valley over who's going to rule the valley, and they end up being very integral parts of the story in there. And over the person did it over a series of years. So they started out just being very comical, and as his skills and his vision for the book changed, they became much more serious characters. But he was skilled enough to pull off the transition. That's another one. I think Watchmen, that's by Alan Moore. That's actually the guy who wrote V for Vendetta also. People refer to that as the ultimate superhero story. And he's created a world where superheroes are outlawed, but they have to come back because one of them has become a renegade and is trying to destroy the world. So all the ones with lesser powers have to come back and come out of hiding.
Sounds a bit like The Incredibles.
I think some of it was based on that. Yeah, I mean all those things are based on these graphic novels of the late '80s. They finally kind of infiltrated our culture. The really fascinating thing about that is that in there he tries to get at what it would really be like if these people existed and if you coexisted with them, and what the world would be like. So it's a fascinating book. In recent years, you have another book I think it's really important called Blanket. It's a very serious book by a young man. It's 700 pages long, and it's about growing up in a religious household, very, very fundamental Christian household, and the restrictions he felt.
Who's the author of that?
That's Craig Thompson.
And the name of that one is?
Blanket.
Blanket, okay.
And then now, but just in recent years, the United States anyway is really experiencing a French invasion in graphic novels. The same way that in the 60s in music we experienced a British invasion, we are having a French invasion. We're having Marianne Satrapi, she's a Persepolis. They're growing up in Iran. She's actually a French citizen now. That's a 2-volume book. It's a fascinating book. David B. is a cartoonist who just did a book called Epileptic, and that's about growing up with one of his siblings was epileptic, and how it really affected their whole family, because they went through years and years of trying to find a cure. That went through living in a commune to adopting a macrobiotic diet to just.
It's a very serious topic.
Yes. Oh yeah, and it's very, very well done. The really biggest.
David B. Sorry, he's French. You're saying?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
B.
I don't know what B stands for. That's his pen name.
Yeah.
And then the other really big book in the United States that I would have to espouse, and I haven't written anything about it because it was published after all my books were written, is Black Hole by Charles Burns. And that's the story of these teenagers living in Seattle in the 1970s.
Is that prior to grunge?
I believe so. Yeah, and they
Nirvana came out of there. And,
right.
Yeah.
So they're living in Seattle, and they contract this disease. All of them do, or this group that he's writing about does. And it may affect, and it's a physical deformity, and it may affect you in a very small way. You may just get some lumps, or it may affect you in this really very severe way. So you're just deformed, and you can't really work and can't really live in society anymore. And they create a society in the woods because of this. And so it's kind of a fantasy story, but he does it so well that it stops being a fantasy story and becomes a metaphor for the isolation that adolescents feel. It's just, and it's done in almost a woodcut style. It's black and white, and I think it's got to be one of the best examples of the form ever created. One of the best. So.
And that was published recently.
Yeah, it came out. He's been doing it for about 10 years. It came out as a book last year in 2005.
Yes. Just in closing, the future of this, you mentioned again during your talk that several years ago you had the sense that this was a bit of a flash in the pan and that it was going to sort of start declining. But given this huge phenomena called manga out of Japan, the Japanese comic book, and their recent alliance with Harper.
Right, but they've done. Other publishers have formed partnerships with other American publishers too. Viz has formed one. It's a publishing phenomenon. I mean, it's a stylized format. But there's a couple of reasons why I think it's so attractive. One is that in Japan they never had the stigma about comic books. Mm-hmm. So it has evolved steadily, and it's pervasive there. All kinds of materials are published in comic book form. Annual reports are published in comic book form. If you go in the subway, everybody's reading a comic book or they're reading manga. And the really fascinating thing about that is that manga isn't that old. It's 60, 65 years old when they started doing it. And the early pioneers, they took their inspiration from the old Disney cartoons. So the characters are actually kind of warped versions of the old the Warner Brothers cartoons.
Did they change the eyes? Because that's a big part of these.
Yeah, that is a big part. I don't know exactly the details of what the change was, but they were greatly inspired by these to create comic books. Because the comic book itself...
And Disney, of course, is huge in Japan. It always has been.
Sure, and comic books themselves, that's an American invention of the early 1930s. So so the history is now, 75 years old, something like that.
Do you feel vindicated? You've sort of been pioneering and espousing the various benefits and qualities of this genre. How do you feel now versus when you started touting them back in whenever it was in the 80s?
Well, it's been an interest of mine for most of my life, so I started touting them about 1970. I feel vindicated. I guess I feel happier that there's a product that's worth feeling vindicated about. Mm-hmm. I don't think that it really was back then. I mean, I think it was a perfectly serviceable genre product, and I don't think it was any worse than a lot of other genre products. But the industry has grown to the point where there are some examples that they can really be proud of.
Mm-hmm. And you've mentioned a number of them, yeah.
Right, and that's a pretty short list. It's a lot bigger list. But.
Yeah. Just closing, we talked a bit about my daughters are 9 and 12, and they, through the Archie comics, I think they learned so much about sort of the whole social dating experience and tools that we were given. Mm-hmm. It just seems that it performs a valuable service.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the readability of these books is really, it's a big component. I mean, the example I'll give you from my own family is that my son, when he was in 3rd grade, he was 2 years behind grade level in reading. And then we discovered Star Wars comics, and that really provided the impetus for him to learn to read, to the point that he grew. By the end of 4th grade, he was on grade level, and by 5th grade, he was reading a novel or a comic interchangeably. That made no difference to him. He doesn't like comics anymore.
Isn't that great? Stepping stone.
Right. So it's certainly a very important component to it.
Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I'll be talking with Stephen Weiner, who is the director of the Maynard Library in Massachusetts and also the author of Faster Than a Speeding Bullet, The Rise of the Graphic Novel.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise. What I'll do is I'll get one of your cards
I actually don't have
Don't
the
have a
card
card
with me.
Let me get your email address.
Okay, sure.